It's just after midnight as Flight 447 rolls off the runway in Rio de Janeiro. The sodium orange glow of the airport ramp smearing into the mist behind it. 228 people settle into their seats. Families flying home, business travelers opening laptops, couples pulling thin airline blankets up against the cabin chill. The route, Rio de Janeiro to Paris, is so routine that this Airbus A330 has already flown it many times before. From the cockpit, the city disappears quickly. The windshield becomes a rectangle of black, broken only by scattered storm cells, painted in green and yellow on the weather radar. Outside, the Atlantic is just a void. No moon, no horizon, no coastline. Only towering anvil-shaped clouds that look like any other tropical night storm off the coast of Brazil. 3 hours into the flight, the jet is cruising at around 35,000 feet, entering a belt of storms that every long-haul crew knows can make for a rough ride. The cockpit is a cave of soft blue and green instrument light. The autopilot holds altitude and heading. The engines hum steadily. On paper, this is the safest kind of flying modern aviation can offer. Then the crew nudges the nose toward what looks like a gap in the weather. The worst radar returns are ahead and to the left. They thread the needle between the clouds, expecting nothing more than some turbulence and a few bumps. No one on board knows that hidden inside those clouds is a much smaller threat. Ice crystals, invisible to radar, already searching for 3 tiny openings on the nose of the aircraft. On the front of the A330, 3 metal probes extend into the airstream. They're called pitot tubes, sensors that measure airspeed by comparing the pressure inside the tube to the air surrounding it. Under normal conditions, they're completely unremarkable. Checked on the walk-around, heated during flight, taken for granted. But without them, the flight computers can't trust their own sense of how fast the jet is moving. As Flight 447 flies deeper into the storm, tiny ice crystals begin to accumulate inside those tubes. Pitot icing at cruise altitude is a known failure mode, considered manageable, not catastrophic. In training and manuals, when airspeed indications go unreliable, crews are taught to ignore the numbers, hold a safe attitude, and ride it out. The expectation is simple. A few seconds of bad data, then the heat clears the ice, and everything returns to normal. On Flight 447, the icing lasts less than a minute. That's all it takes. Inside the cockpit, the airspeed values flicker and fall. Different instruments start to disagree. One speed drops, another spikes, and the flight management systems begin to lose confidence in the numbers flowing in. The computers follow their programming. They interpret the unreliable data as a serious fault and respond by disconnecting the autopilot and autothrust. The protection net that has quietly flown the jet for hours simply lets go. There is no loud voice saying the pitot tubes are frozen. There is only a chime, some alerts, and a sudden change in the feel of the controls. From this point on, the safety of everyone on board depends on how 3 human beings interpret a handful of conflicting warnings and fly a jet they haven't hand-flown at high altitude in a very long time. The pilot flying at this moment is one of the 2 co-pilots. The captain is resting in the crew bunk as long-haul procedures allow. When the autopilot drops, the co-pilot pulls back on his side stick, a reflexive attempt to maintain altitude as the instruments seem to fall apart around him. The nose of the A330 rises. The angle of attack increases. The engines keep producing thrust, but the wings begin to lose lift. The stall warning sounds, a harsh, synthetic voice repeating, "Stall, stall," cuts through the cockpit noise. But the data feeding that warning is tied to the same unreliable airspeed system. As the speed readings swing wildly, The stall alarm turns on and off, sometimes silencing itself at the worst possible moments because the computers briefly see numbers outside their trigger range. For the humans in that cockpit, the picture is a smear of noise. Unreliable speed indications, flight control protections dropping away, stall warnings that flash on and off without matching anything they expect to see. One co-pilot believes they are overspeeding and pulls back further, trying to climb away from an imagined high-speed danger. The other tries to reconcile the instruments and warns about the stall. Their words become fragmented, uncertain, and at times contradictory. There is no shared understanding of what the aircraft is actually doing. The A330 climbs to around 38,000 feet, and then, fully stalled, begins to sink. But from the cockpit, the nose is still up. The sensation is closer to riding an elevator that's dropping, while the floor appears level. The jet falls through the sky belly first, engines running, wings angled so steeply that air can no longer flow cleanly over them. For the next 4 minutes and 23 seconds, Flight 447 is in a sustained stall. Nose high, descending at thousands of feet per minute, without the crew ever committing to a recovery. From the cabin, the fall feels like severe turbulence. There is no dramatic nose-down sensation, no weightlessness, nothing that screams, "We are falling." From the cockpit, the instruments keep fighting the crew's expectations until the ocean surface finally rises to meet the aircraft. Investigators later reconstructed the last minutes of Flight 447 from the recovered flight data recorders, found nearly 2 years after the crash on the Atlantic seabed. What they found was not a sudden mechanical breakup. It was a long, controlled fall in an aircraft that remained structurally intact, whose engines never stopped working. After the initial pitch-up, the descent rate increased downward. The angle of attack stayed dangerously high. The stall warning sounded, again and again, as the jet fell from cruise altitude toward the ocean. At times the warning stopped, not because the stall ended, but because the speed data briefly crossed a threshold that told the computer, incorrectly, that the danger had passed. The co-pilots made inputs that were, in hindsight, the opposite of what the situation demanded. They kept pulling back, kept the nose up, never fully committed to pushing it down. The captain returned to the cockpit, confronted with a jet already far outside its normal flight envelope, falling fast, with conflicting clues on every screen and very little time left to reverse what had already taken hold. By the time they were below 10,000 feet, the A330 was descending at a rate that gave them seconds, not minutes. The aircraft struck the Atlantic essentially level, belly first, at very high vertical speed. The structure was destroyed. Everyone on board was killed. The ocean surface was still just another patch of night, indistinguishable from the sky until impact. No one on board ever saw a runway, a coastline, or a single light to aim for. In the early days after the crash, headlines spoke of a jet that vanished, that fell from the sky for 4 minutes, and nobody knew why. The investigation would eventually show there was nothing supernatural about it. Only the tragic combination of a small sensor failure, a cockpit flooded with confusing warnings, and a crew whose training had not prepared them for what they were facing. The French Accident Investigation Bureau, known as the BEA, spent years analyzing Flight 447. Their final report did not point to a single villain. It pointed to a chain, interacting factors stacking on top of each other. At the technical level, the initiating event was clear. Ice crystals blocked all three pitot-probes, producing unreliable airspeed data. In response, the autopilot and autothrust disconnected, and the aircraft dropped into a less protected flight control mode. At the human level, investigators found a loss of situational awareness as the pilots struggled to interpret conflicting instruments, inadequate training for unreliable airspeed at high altitude, and communication breakdowns that left no one in the cockpit with a clear, shared picture of what the jet was actually doing. The BEA was careful to say this: the pilots were not incompetent. They were not reckless. Their reactions were credible human responses to a complex, poorly signaled failure in a highly automated cockpit. The flight deck was full of data, but not enough clear guidance about which data to trust or what to do first under that kind of time pressure. Automation played a double role in this accident. Under normal conditions, it made the flight safe and smooth. Under abnormal conditions, its sudden withdrawal and the way it changed the rules without clearly telling the crew left three people trying to reconstruct a mental picture of their aircraft with too little time and too much noise. One human factors study described it plainly. A loss of cognitive control of the situation led to a loss of physical control of the aircraft. The pilots didn't lose control because they panicked. They lost control because they never reached a clear, accurate understanding of what the airplane was doing before gravity finished the conversation. Recovering the flight recorders was itself a story of persistence. The main wreckage lay in deep Atlantic water, and for almost 2 years, search teams could not find the cockpit voice recorder or the flight data recorder. Families lived with a brutal kind of ambiguity. They knew their loved ones had died, but the world did not yet know how. In April of 2011, renewed search efforts finally located the wreckage field, and the recorders were brought to the surface. For investigators, it meant the final minutes could be reconstructed in precise detail. Control inputs, instrument readings, warning activations, the pilot's own words. The data told a story that was both technically fascinating and deeply difficult to sit with. A flyable aircraft, functioning engines, intact structure, falling in a long stall, because the humans at the controls misunderstood what their own sensors were telling them. The data also confirmed something uncomfortable. There had been previous reports of pitot-probe issues on similar aircraft, issues that had not been fully addressed before this flight. The final report concluded the crash resulted from a combination of pitot-probe icing and unreliable airspeed data, flight control behavior that complicated the crew's mental model, insufficient training in manual handling and stall recovery at high altitude, and human factors, startle, cognitive overload, and breakdowns in crew coordination. For many pilots who read that report, the reaction was a mix of horror and uncomfortable recognition. The scenario was complex, but it was not unimaginable. Under the right conditions, another crew could have found themselves in the same trap. If Flight 447 had been simply a freak accident, an unrepeatable combination of bad weather and bad luck, its story might have ended with the report. Instead, it became a case study that reshaped how airlines, regulators, and manufacturers think about automation, training, and human performance. One of the clearest lessons was the need to strengthen manual flying skills, especially at high altitude and especially in unreliable airspeed scenarios. Across the industry, regulators and airlines introduced what's now called upset prevention and recovery training, requiring pilots to practice stall recognition and recovery in simulators not just read about it in a manual. Crews now routinely train scenarios where airspeed data fails, where automation disconnects without warning, and where the correct response is to hold a known, safe pitch and power setting and resist the urge to chase contradictory numbers. On the design side, manufacturers reviewed how warning systems behave when multiple failures stack on top of each other. The AF447 investigation highlighted real problems with how stall warnings and flight mode changes were communicated to crews. And work began to clarify alerts, reduce intermittent or false warnings, and make automation transitions more transparent. The core principle that emerged was simple. Automation should support human understanding, not just enforce rules. When things go wrong, the system must help pilots build an accurate mental model quickly, not overwhelm them with poorly prioritized alarms. On the hardware side, more reliable pitot-probe models were installed across affected fleets. Maintenance regimes were tightened, and simulator scenarios began treating unreliable airspeed as a serious, realistic emergency, not a minor inconvenience to be brushed past. Crew resource management training was strengthened, emphasizing shared mental models, assertive cross-checking, and clear leadership when instruments disagree. Pilots are now more explicitly taught to say out loud what they think is happening, challenge each other's assumptions, and speak up when actions don't match the actual situation. Regulators issued guidance to reduce over-reliance on automation and ensure that manual flying skills are maintained throughout a pilot's entire career, not just built up in training and then quietly allowed to fade. For the families of those lost on Flight 447, no improvement in training or aircraft design can fully compensate for what was taken from them. 228 people. Lives, relationships, futures ended over the Atlantic in the early hours of the 1st of June, 2009. And yet the legacy of this accident is real, and it is visible in how modern jets are flown and how they are built. Today, when a crew encounters unreliable airspeed at cruise, they are far more likely to have practiced that exact scenario, to know a simple, robust set of actions. Hold the attitude. Hold the power. Ignore the transient numbers until the system stabilizes. When a stall warning sounds unexpectedly at high altitude, pilots are now trained to treat it with the same urgency as a low-altitude stall, to push the nose down, even when the instruments are confusing, and to trust the physics of lift over the flickering digits on a screen. Automation has continued to advance, but now with far more attention to how humans and machines work together under stress. Interfaces are being designed to surface what matters most and to avoid trapping crews in situations where they must decode complex logic in the seconds they don't have. Most importantly, Flight 447 is not taught as a story of incompetent pilots. It is taught as a story of ordinary professionals placed in an extraordinarily confusing situation by a chain of failures that no single person created and no single person could easily have stopped. By studying what happened in detail, the industry made changes that reduce the chance of another crew facing the same trap. A night storm, unreliable sensors, automation stepping back, and a stall warning getting lost in the noise. When you board a wide-body jet today for a transatlantic night crossing, you fly in a world that has been quietly, invisibly shaped by the lessons of Flight 447.